At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. Because, after all, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it that way. I'm Johnny. Let's begin. Of all the enemies Queen Vakira had disintegrated, disemboweled, or deposed, the most stubborn proved to be her own 2 legs. Her legs told her she was standing on solid ground, a phantom pressure against the soles of her feet, a tingle of pins and needles that promised a return to sensation that would never come. They were there, pale and motionless beneath the thin thermal sheet, but they were no longer hers. They belonged to the explosion, to the betrayal, to the past. She could remember with agonizing clarity the feeling of the deck plates beneath her boots, the slight vibration of the ship's engines. Now, there was only a dull, disconnected weight and the mocking echo of memory. Queen Vakira of the Thalmessian Dominion, conqueror of the Persian Arm, breaker of the Seren hegemony, tried to command her toes to wiggle. Nothing. She sent the mental command again, a shout in the silent theater of her own mind, laced with the iron authority that had made fleets tremble. Her legs remained impassive, 2 lengths of useless meat attached to her spine. The silence in her nerves was louder than any battle, a roaring emptiness where commands went to die. Her pupils, slitted like a predator's, narrowed to razor-thin lines in the dim light, a physiological response to a fury that had nowhere to go. The door to her chamber hissed open. He entered without announcement, a ghost in the gilded cage they'd built for her. He carried a tray. On it, a bowl of gray nutrient paste, a bulb of water, and her morning dose of pain suppressants. He was a monument to her former life, to her arrogance. Elian, the human. Captured in some forgotten border skirmish, he'd met her gaze in the throne room, not with the terror she expected, but with a quiet, infuriating defiance. So, she had bought him, not for labor, but for the pleasure of breaking that defiance. A warrior queen's whim. She'd made him her personal attendant, a living trophy of her power, a constant reminder to all of her court that even the will of a human officer was a thing she could own. Now, he was all she had left. The irony was a physical pain, as sharp and real as the grinding ache where her spine had been hastily fused back together by medical regeneration that could rebuild tissue, but not the intricate pathways of a nervous system. "Where is my royal guard?" she rasped, her voice a ruin of its former resonant command, cracked and dry from disuse. The human set the tray on the bedside table. His movements were economical, each one executed with deliberate care, no wasted motion. He didn't look at her, his focus entirely on the placement of the bowl. "They were recalled to the capital 2 days ago." Recalled? The word was a spike of ice in her gut. "By whose authority?" "The Council of Matrons." He finally met her eyes. His were the color of a stormy sea, unreadable and calm. There was no triumph in them, no hint of schadenfreude. There was nothing. That was worse. A request from the new command. The recall order included all Thalmassian staff. He paused, and for a moment his gaze lost its neutral mask, replaced by a glint of dry understanding. They considered me part of the fortress's fixtures, unworthy of a specific directive. Vakira stared at him. The truth of his words settled on her, a crushing burden. Of course, the arrogance of the council was its own kind of weapon. They wouldn't have wasted a thought on the disposition of a human slave. He wasn't a person. He was equipment, and so he remained. The remote moon, the crumbling fortress, the skeleton crew, now vanished. The advanced star systems powering down one by one, leaving only life support and gravity. They hadn't sent her here to recover. They had sent her here to be forgotten, to die. A fierce warrior queen, crippled in battle, saved from immediate death only to be abandoned to a slower, more humiliating one. And the only one here to witness it, to perform the final rites of her decay, was the human slave she despised. She looked from his impassive face to the bowl of grape paste. It was the ultimate humiliation. "Get out," she snarled. "You need to eat," he said, his voice quiet, maddeningly reasonable. "I need you to leave my presence." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and walked to the door. It hissed shut behind him, leaving her alone with the silence, the useless legs, and the steaming bowl of gruel that was her new life. The day split into a uniform gray, marked only by the humans' arrivals and departures. Akira learned the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, a steady, unhurried rhythm that grated on her nerves. She tried to reclaim some sliver of her old power by turning her necessities into torments for him. "The water is too cold." He would take the bulb, leave, and return minutes later with one fractionally warmer, without comment. "This paste tastes of desperation and failure." "It's the same as yesterday," he'd reply, his voice flat. "Then yesterday also tasted of failure, a recurring theme in this mausoleum." He never rose to the bait. He performed his duties with a detached professionalism that was more insulting than any overt disrespect. He bathed her, fed her, administered her medication, and moved her from the bed to the grav chair as if she were a piece of delicate, non-sentient machinery. He'd place one hand on her hip, the other under her shoulder, and lift. She was a piece of cargo to be shifted. There was no gentleness, but there was also no cruelty. It was a sterile, infuriating competence. "Move me," she commanded one afternoon, the stone walls of her chamber seeming to press in on her. She stared at the architecture, a feature she had never bothered to notice in her previous life. The walls were meant to be elegant, with no right angles, only load-bearing curves that flowed into one another, a classic example of Old Dominion grace. Now, cracks spiderwebbed across the flowing lines, and dust gathered in the hollows. Beauty in a state of decay, a perfect mirror for her. "Where?" "To the window, you imbecile. I wish to see the dust you call a landscape." He wheeled the grav chair to the tall, arched window. Outside, jagged peaks of rust-colored rock clawed at a bruised purple sky. It was a desolate, forgotten place, a perfect tomb. She hated it. She hated the sight of it. She hated him for showing it to her. "You have a combat engineer's hands," she said, the words tasting like acid. "You handle me like a broken-down power conduit." "Is there a problem with my technique?" he asked, his focus on adjusting the chair's altitude. "Your technique is functional." She spat the word. In Thelmacian culture, to be merely functional was to be an object of contempt. Their technology, their art, their very lives were meant to be elegant, integrated, beautiful. He was the antithesis of everything she'd been raised to value. "Good," he said. "Functionality is the goal." She wanted to scream. She wanted to have him flogged. She wanted to feel her pulse blade in her hand and see the fear in an enemy's eyes. Instead, she was trapped in a broken body, her only companion a man whose spirit she had failed to break, and who now held her life in his calloused, functional hands. The pain in her spine flared, a sharp, grinding reminder. She bit down on her lip, turning her face to the window to hide the wince. But the tiny muscles around the base of her horns tightened involuntarily, a tell she knew he wouldn't understand. But he spoke anyway. Pain medication? She flinched. Had he noticed? No, she lied. He didn't argue. He just stood there, a silent presence at her shoulder, until the spasm passed. His silence was a kind of power, she realized, the power of endurance. He was waiting her out. One shift, he left something new on her bedside table, a data slate, thin and clearly not of Thelmacian design. It was a dark, utilitarian gray, a slab of brutal, functional geometry, all sharp corners and exposed connection ports. It was an ugly, honest thing compared to the seamless, flowing designs of Thelmacian tech she was used to, which hid all their workings behind polished surfaces. "What is this garbage?" she asked when he returned with her evening meal. "Something to read," he said. "The fortress archives were wiped remotely. I thought you might be bored." "I am a queen, not a provincial matron with time for frivolous stories." He just nodded and turned to leave. Curiosity, that most undignified of emotions, was a persistent itch. For hours, she let the slate lie there, a challenge to her pride. But the silence of the room was a crushing weight, and the view from the window never changed. Finally, with a sigh of self-loathing, she picked it up. It was human literature. Poetry. She scoffed. The sentimental ramblings of a soft species. She scrolled through the files, her lip curled in disdain. Epics about lost love, odes to flowers, sonnets about the passage of time. Pathetic. Then, a title caught her eye. Invictus. Unconquerable. An audacious claim. She read the words. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. Something in her chest tightened. The words were crude, lacking the layered nuance of Thelmacian high verse, but they were resonant. They were granite. She found herself wrestling with the text, fighting its simplistic sincerity while being drawn to its core of defiance. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. A lie. She had done both. But the poem wasn't about what had happened. It was about the response. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody, but unbowed. She had been a conqueror. She understood the will to dominate, to refuse defeat. This poem was not about conquest, but about a different kind of strength, the strength to endure what cannot be defeated. It was a foreign concept, yet it resonated with the part of her that still raged within the prison of her flesh. That night, when a phantom cramp seized her calf, a fire of non-existent signals that was agonizingly real, she didn't call for him. She closed her eyes, her scaled knuckles white where she gripped the sheets, and whispered the words into the darkness. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. The pain didn't lessen, but her endurance of it found a new foundation. It was a small, secret victory, and it was the first thing in a long time that felt truly her own. The fever came on her like a thief in the night, stealing the cool control she fought so hard to maintain. The fortress's aging climate controls flickered, and a damp chill sank into her bones. waking the hornet's nests of mangled nerves in her spine. She was falling, tumbling through black space, the roar of an explosion filling her ears. The deck of her flagship, the wheel, buckled beneath her. Metal screamed. She saw the face of her second-in-command, General Tevrin, her most trusted advisor for 20 years. Tevrin's dark eyes were wide, not with fear, but with satisfaction. A cruel, sharp curving of the lips just before the world dissolved into white-hot agony. The memory was so clear, so visceral, it felt like it was happening all over again. No! Akira woke, thrashing. The sheets twisted around her useless legs like funeral shrouds. Her skin was on fire, her breath coming in ragged sobs. A firm, cool pressure settled on her forehead. She flinched, her eyes snapping open. Elian was there, kneeling by her bed. In the dim light of the chamber, his face was a landscape of shadows, his expression unreadable as ever. His touch, however, was steadying and careful, lacking the detached functionality of his usual care. The rough callus of his thumb brushed against the faint mica-like scales on her temple, a texture so different from her own smooth-skinned people, a point of solid reality in her swirling delirium. Tevrin, she choked out, the name tasting like poison. She was there. She smiled. He didn't speak. He simply took the cloth, dipped it in a basin of cool water beside the bed, and wrung it out with those efficient hands. He wiped the sweat from her brow, his movements slow and deliberate. The coolness was a balm against the fever's heat. His presence was an anchor in the storm of her delirium. She was a queen. She was a conqueror. She did not show weakness. But the fever had burned away her pride, leaving only raw, shivering pain and the fresh terror of her memory. She was so very tired of being strong. She stopped fighting the tremors that racked her body. Her head fell back against the pillow, and a tear, hot and shameful, escaped the corner of her eye and traced a path through the scales on her cheekbone. Elian's hand paused in its ministration. He said nothing. He did not offer empty comfort or pitying words. He just held the cool cloth to her temple, his thumb brushing away the tear with a quiet, practical motion. It was a moment of pure, non-clinical care, an acknowledgement of her suffering, not just her condition. The fever broke, leaving her weak and hollowed out, but clear-headed for the first time in weeks. The fortress's climate systems stabilized, and the oppressive chill receded. Elian entered her chambers that morning, not with a food tray, but with a determined look in his eye. Your muscles are starting to atrophy, he said, his tone direct. If you ever hope to regain any measure of control, assuming a treatment becomes available, you can't let them waste away. And what do you propose, human? That I simply will them to move? No, he said. I'll move them for you. Physical therapy. The idea was mortifying. The intimacy of it, the complete surrender of her body to his hands for such a purpose. It was a new level of helplessness. But the alternative, to lie here and wither into a pathetic husk, was worse. Very well, she said, her voice clipped. Proceed. The regimen was grueling and humiliating. He would lift her leg, supporting the dead weight of it, and slowly bend her knee, flex her ankle, stretch the hamstring. He worked with the same dispassionate focus he applied to everything, his touch firm and impersonal. But the proximity was unavoidable. The scent of him, a clean, slightly metallic smell, like charged air after a storm, filled her senses. As the days went on, she noticed a change. His touch, while still firm, was no longer merely rote. It became mapped to the anticipated ache of her muscles, gentler on the insertions, firmer on the bellies. He had learned the geography of her pain. To reclaim some semblance of control, she turned the sessions into a different kind of instruction. "Your posture wastes energy," she said one day, as he knelt to manipulate her foot. "You leave your core exposed. A child with a sticker knife could disembowel you." He paused, looking up at her. "I'm not in a combat stance, Vakira." It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it from his lips was jarring, yet not unwelcome. It was a claim of sorts, an assertion of something other than servitude. "All stances are combat stances," she retorted. "The universe is a battlefield. To believe otherwise is to be a fool or a corpse. Now brace your abdomen, widen your base. You are strong, but your strength is unrefined." He adjusted his position, a brief hint of amusement touching the corners of his eyes. "Show me." Since she could not show him, she told him. As he worked her limbs, she instructed him in the intricate theories of Thalmassian pulse-blade combat, the 18 cuts of sorrow, the unblinking gaze defense, the philosophy of finding the calm center within the hurricane of battle. He listened intently. He didn't just hear the words, he processed them. He asked sharp, tactical questions that revealed a military mind. "The 9th cut, the serpent's kiss," he said, his hands gently rotating her hip joint. He stopped as he felt a subtle tension radiate from her. He looked up at her face. "It's a feint, designed to draw a high block, opening the ribs up for a follow-up thrust. But the energy signature of the blade's pre-fire capacitor would give it away to anyone with decent tactical sensors. It's a move for dueling, not for the battlefield." She stared at him, stunned into silence. He was right. It was a weakness in the classical form, one only a true technician of warfare would spot. Not only that, but he had read her body's subtle reaction to the movement, a spike of pain she had tried to hide. "How would you know that?" "I wasn't always a slave," he said, meeting her gaze. "My defiance in your throne room wasn't born of arrogance. It was born of experience." A new kind of rapport began to form between them, forged in the space between her military theory and his practical analysis. Their relationship had been changed. Queen and caretaker had given way to two strategists, two soldiers, trapped on opposite sides of a war that suddenly felt very far away. A few days later, Elian produced an object that looked ancient. It was a board, inlaid with a grid of metallic squares, and a set of weighted, magnetic pieces carved into abstract shapes. Its design was stark, geometric, possessing a crude, functional beauty that she initially scoffed at. "Gravity chess," he explained, setting it on a low table he'd wheeled next to her grav chair. "An old human game. The rules are simple. The strategy is not." Vakira, a master of the Thalmassian equivalent, a complex holographic game called Kaya, looked at the crude board with disdain. "A child's game." "Perhaps," he said, setting up the pieces. "Your move." They played for days. Her first games were disasters. She was a conqueror. Her Kaya strategy was legendary, a swift, overwhelming offense that shattered enemy lines before they could mount a defense. She applied the same logic to the human game, pushing her pieces forward in an aggressive, glorious assault. Leon responded with a quiet, maddeningly effective defense. He yielded territory, sacrificed minor pieces, and built an interlocking wall of support that blunted her every attack. He was a fortress. He absorbed her fury, redirected her momentum, and slowly, inexorably, turned her own aggression against her. He didn't defeat her. He allowed her to defeat herself. She stared at the board after one particularly brutal loss, her king piece trapped, her army in ruins. She had never been so thoroughly dismantled. "You play like a combat engineer," she said, the words a mix of accusation and awe. "You don't attack. You build traps." "The goal isn't to be the sharpest sword," he said, resetting the pieces for another game. "It's to be the last one standing on the wall." I was an Alliance tactical officer, Corps of Engineers. On the frontier, when your plasma reactor is leaking, charging it with a pulse rifle is useless. The only response is to analyze the problem, reinforce the weaknesses, and find a way to vent the pressure before it blows everyone to hell. He looked up from the board, and for the first time, he spoke of his past not as a prisoner, but as a man. He told her of holding a breach in a ship's hull with nothing but a patch kit and a prayer, of jury-rigging atmospheric processors on hostile moons, of the quiet satisfaction of making something work against overwhelming odds. "Fix it or die," he said with a wry, tired smile. That was the Corps' unofficial motto. She, in turn, found herself speaking of her own past, not as a litany of glorious conquests, but as a series of tactical problems. The siege of Orion 6, where she'd used the system's asteroid belt as a kinetic weapon. The pacification of the Skarn, where she'd exploited a schism in their warrior caste. The air in the room changed. They were speaking the universal language of soldiers, of strategists, of survivors. The Gilded Cage had become a war room for two. The next day, Elian was gone for most of the light shift. Bakira found herself tracking the hours, an unfamiliar unease settling in her gut. The silence of the fortress was no longer a sign of her isolation. It was a sign of his absence. He returned near dusk, covered in grease and dust, his face smudged, but his eyes bright with purpose. He was carrying a bizarre contraption. It was a mess of wires, salvaged power cells, and a bent of comms antenna, all bolted to the chassis of what looked like an ancient emergency beacon. "What is that monstrosity?" she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "Hope," he said, setting it down on a workbench he'd cleared in the corner. He ran a diagnostic, his hands moving in a blur of swift, economical motions across a jury-rigged interface. He'd been disappearing for hours at a time for over a week, and this was the fruit of his labor. This fortress is old. Before the Dominion upgraded everything to their proprietary biocircuitry, it ran on standard kinetic and radio tech. I found the old maintenance bay, a ghost of a more practical age. Most of it was stripped, but not all of it. He pointed to the antenna. This bypasses standard military comms, which are too easy to trace. It's a low-power, encrypted burst transmitter that sends a repeating signal on a black market smuggler frequency. He looked at her, his sea-gray eyes serious. "It's a digital message in a bottle. A shot in the dark, but I have an old contact, a freighter captain who operates in the outer territories. She owes me a life debt. If she's still out there, if her receivers are still sweeping for this frequency, she might hear it." Bakira felt a surge of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. It was a fragile, terrifying thing. Hope. "And what does your message say?" "It says her old engineer is in trouble, and he's with someone who can make it worth her while to take a very big risk." "Do it." He flipped a final switch. A small green light on the console blinked to life. A low hum filled the room. The signal was out, a whisper in the vast, indifferent darkness of space. They had no idea if anyone would ever hear it. It was a desperate, uncertain act. But it was the first move they had made together. The ion storm came without warning, a furious squall of charged particles that slammed into the moon and played hell with the fortress's already failing systems. The lights flickered, buzzed, and died, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. The low hum of the life support systems stuttered into a strained whine. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced Vakira's composure. The dark, the silence, the groaning of the ancient fortress around her. It was the feeling of being in a tomb. "Elian?" Her voice was a bare whisper, stripped of all its royal authority. "I'm here." His voice came from nearby, calm and steady. A moment later, there was a soft, scraping sound and a flicker of light. He'd ignited a chemical light stick, casting the room in a pale, eerie green glow. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, a few feet from her grav chair. He looked completely unfazed. In the wavering green light, her control finally shattered. "They left me here to die," she said, the words tearing from her throat. "A broken relic, forgotten. I, who carved my name across the stars, will die in a dusty, powerless ruin on a rock no one can even name." He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He just listened, his head tilted, his gaze intent. The wind howled outside, rattling the window frame. When she fell silent, trembling, he asked a question. It was quiet, but it cut through her grief like a surgeon's scalpel. "Who was General Tevrin's rival on the council?" The question was so unexpected it stunned her. "What?" "The ambush wasn't just to injure you," he said, his voice low and intense. He was thinking like an engineer again, analyzing a system for its point of failure. "It was a move on the board, a piece being taken. The explosion that crippled you, the best care that exiled you, it was all part of a plan. So forget the bomb for a moment, forget Tevrin's smile. Who gained the most by having you removed from power?" The fog of her pain and self-pity began to clear, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of political calculus. She had been so focused on the physical betrayal, the rending of her body. He was forcing her to see the true attack, the political execution. "Seraph," she breathed. "My cousin. Ambitious, cunning. She always saw my directness as a weakness. Tevrin was her creature. All this time, I thought Tevrin betrayed me for her own ambition." "No," Elian said, pushing himself to his feet. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides. "Tevrin was the weapon. Seraph was the hand that aimed it." He stood before her, the green light carving his face into sharp angles. He stood before her an ally, her strategist. He was the one person who saw her not as a cripple or a former queen, but as a player still in the game. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. The rough texture of his skin against the fine, cool scales of hers was a grounding sensation. It was not a gesture of pity, but of profound empathy, of solidarity. "They left you for dead," he murmured, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "They made a mistake." She leaned into his touch, a silent, shuddering admission of everything she had lost and everything she might, with him, reclaim. The universe shrank to the space between them, the howl of the storm and the groan of the dying fortress fading into nothing. He lowered his head and he kissed her. It was one of shared desperation and burgeoning hope, of 2 survivors finding an unexpected shore in the middle of a storm. It was the taste of charged air and defiance, and for the first time in a very long time, Vakira did not feel broken. She felt found. The next morning, the storm had passed. The emergency power had kicked in, restoring a dim, steady light to the fortress. The world was quiet again. But everything had changed. When Vakira woke, it was not to the sight of an empty room. Elian had moved his own simple cot from its storage alcove to the far side of her chamber. It was a silent, unambiguous declaration. "I am with you." He brought her the morning meal. The silence that settled between them as she ate was not the tense, hostile emptiness of weeks past, but a comfortable, shared quiet. He met her gaze over the rim of her water bowl. "Good morning, Vakira." "Elian," she replied, the name feeling natural on her tongue for the first time. They were a unit now, Jailer and prisoner had been replaced. They were two people against an empire. The fortress was no longer her gilded cage. It was their command post. Weeks crawled by. The green light on Elian's cobbled-together transmitter blinked its lonely, hopeful pulse into the dark. Then, one rotation, it happened. The light changed, flashing a rapid, frantic pattern. "It's a handshake signal," Elian breathed, his fingers moving swiftly across the makeshift console, tapping out a reply. "She heard us." A day later, a ship descended from the purple sky. It was a battered, ugly thing, a freighter that looked like it was held together with sheer stubbornness and mismatched parts. It made a risky, rumbling landing on a flat expanse of rock a kilometer from the fortress. Elian went to meet it alone. Vakira watched from the window, her hands gripping the arms of her grav chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. He returned hours later, accompanied by a gruff Skarn whose face looked like a geological event. The being's lower set of arms was crossed imposingly over its wide chest. The smuggler captain, a female named Durga, gave Vakira a long, assessing look. "So you're the high-value asset," Durga grunted, her voice a low rasp that scraped the air. "You said you were important. Didn't say you were the ghost of a queen." She folded her upper arms, a gesture of impatience. "This life debt of his just got expensive." "It will be paid with interest," Vakira said, her voice cool and steady. "With trade monopolies in a dominion under new management." Durga's eyes widened slightly. Then a slow, dangerous grin spread across her face. "Now you're speaking my language." She tossed a data cache onto the table. "Fresh from Thaumasia Throne." Elian plugged it into their slate. He and Vakira watched as the official news feeds from Thaumasia Throne scrolled across the screen. There were pronouncements from the Council of Matrons, footage of slate functions, economic reports. And then they saw it. A formal declaration draped in black and purple banners, an announcement of a state funeral for a fallen hero. Queen Vakira, it said, had succumbed to the grievous injuries she sustained in a tragic terrorist attack. Her passing was mourned across the Dominion. The next image made Vakira's blood run cold. It was Seraph, her cousin, standing before the throne, robed in the raiment of a ruling queen. The Council of Matrons stood behind her, their faces grim and pious masks hiding their treachery. Tevrin was at her right hand, now promoted to Grand Marshal of the Dominion Fleet. A wave of grief, so sharp and cold it stole her breath, washed over Vakira. It was one thing to be betrayed. It was another to be erased, to have her life, her legacy, stolen and replaced. Elian's hand settled on her shoulder, a warm, solid weight. He didn't speak, just stood with her as she stared at the face of her own ghost. Finally, she looked away from the screen, her grief hardening into a diamond-hard point of rage. Her pupils had narrowed to pinpricks. The maintenance bay became their forge. Durga, bought with the promise of lucrative, exclusive trade rights in the new order they would build, had left them a power core and a toolkit that made Elian's eyes light up with an engineer's joy. "This is the anvil," Vakira said, spreading out a holographic schematic of the capital's citadel. She pointed out security flaws, patrol routes she herself had designed, the psychological weaknesses of the council matrons she knew so well. "My knowledge, the unmovable weakness at the heart of their power." "Then we need a hammer," Elian replied, his attention fixed on a hulking piece of machinery in the corner of the bay. It was a cargo-loading exoskeleton, an ancient, purely mechanical rig designed for lifting heavy munitions. It was a relic of a bygone era, all hydraulics, pistons, and thick steel struts. For days, he worked. He adapted, he cannibalized, he stripped the exoskeleton down to its legs and pelvic girdle. He rewired its power systems to the new core. The true genius of his work was in the interface. Thalmassian medicine had failed because it couldn't bridge the gap between her organic nerves and a synthetic device. Elian bypassed the nerves entirely. He recalibrated the suit's myoelectric sensors, making them sensitive enough to read the minute muscle impulses in her upper torso and back. Muscles she still fully controlled. A lean forward initiated a step. A twist of her core controlled direction. It was crude. It was brutally direct. When it was finished, it was the ugliest, most beautiful functional thing Vakira had ever seen. A set of heavy mechanical leg braces humming with raw power. Getting into it was an ordeal. He had to lift her, position her, and strap her in. The metal was cold against her skin. "Ready?" he asked, his hands on her waist, his face filled with a tense hope. She nodded, her throat tight. He powered it on. A low hiss of hydraulics filled the bay. She took a breath, focused, and leaned forward. Clank! Sss! The right leg swung forward, the heavy metal foot hitting the Duracrete floor with a percussive shock that vibrated up her entire body. She pitched forward, a gasp escaping her lips, but years of a warrior's instinct made her twist her torso to compensate. Clank! Hiss! The left leg followed. She was standing. Shaky, unsteady, but standing. Supported by steel and ingenuity. She took another step, then another. It was exhausting. Alien. The first time she tried to turn, she overcompensated, and the massive legs tangled. She fell, the crash of metal on concrete echoing in the bay. Alien was there in an instant, powering down the rig, unstrapping her. He didn't coddle her. He just checked the machinery, then helped her back up. Again. For days she trained, her body aching, her pride smarting with every fall. But with each session, the movements became less alien. She learned to translate the fluid grace of a swordsman into the powerful, deliberate motions of a machine. The chair was a memory. She was a warrior in her armor. She finally managed a full circuit of the bay, her steps loud and rhythmic. She looked at Elian, a fierce, triumphant grin spreading across her face. He was smiling back, a look of pure, unadulterated pride and profound relief in his eyes, as if he'd been carrying the weight of her immobility right alongside her. While Vakira mastered her new legs, Elian used Durga's comm system to wage a different kind of war. Durga smuggled him into the underbelly of the capital city, the sprawling, multi-species warrens where the Dominion's vast slave population lived and toiled. He didn't try to create a rebellion. The kindling was already there. In centuries of oppression, it was just fractured, divided by species, by function, by the Council's deliberate strategy of pitting them against each other. Elian's job was to provide the spark and the focus. He met with a Skarn foreman named Dask in the deafening roar of the plasma forges. Dask, a being of immense physical power, spat on the ground when Elian mentioned the new queen. "Seraph is a viper," Dask growled. "Since she took the throne, the quotas have doubled. My crew is breaking. 3 were executed last week for exhaustion. Under Vakira it was hard, but Seraph, it is unbearable." This was the leverage Elian needed. Seraph's harsh consolidation of power had made the situation volatile. He found the secretive leader of the clerical caste, a willowy species who handled the Empire's data flow. He negotiated with the fierce, pack-based hunters used as enforcers. To each of them, he brought a tailored message. "The Council lied," he told them. "The warrior queen lives. The one they told you was a tyrant was betrayed by the same soft-handed nobles who hold your chains. She was crippled and left to rot, just as they would leave you. But she survived. She is returning, and she will not forget who stood with her when the throne was stolen." He used his tactical mind to forge their disparate resentments into a single, coordinated plan. The forge workers would sabotage the power conduits of the Citadel. The data clerks would crash the internal security network. The hunters would create chaos in the noble sector. Vakira, the fierce warrior queen, became their symbol, a myth, the betrayed avenger, the promise of a reckoning. Elian didn't build an army. He aimed a revolution. The uprising ignited the capital like a torch to dry fuel. The city descended into chaos. Alarms blared, smoke filled the sky, and the sound of battle echoed from the grand plazas to the squalid undertunnels. It was the perfect storm. Amid the pandemonium, a single stolen diplomatic skiff, flying falsified clearance codes provided by the data clerks, landed silently on a platform of the Royal Citadel. The door hissed open. Vakira stepped out. The throne room was in a state of controlled panic. Seraph was on the dais, shouting orders at a terrified aide, while the council matrons huddled together, their elegant facades cracking under the pressure. Grand Marshal Tevrin was barking commands into a comms unit, trying to rally the Citadel Guard against a threat that was coming from every direction at once. Then they heard it. A sound no one in the Citadel had ever heard before, a sound from a cruder, more violent age. Clank. Hiss. Clank. Hiss. The throne room doors burst open, slammed aside by the sheer force of Akira's entrance. She stood there, silhouetted against the chaos outside, a titan of metal and fury. The heavy, functional braces of her exoskeleton were a brutalist sculpture of vengeance. Her obsidian eyes, slitted and burning with cold fire, swept the room. Every voice died. Every eye turned to her. To the ghost, a matron dropped her data slate, its elegant casing shattering on the polished floor, the sound lost in the next percussive clank of the Queen's advance. Tevrin, the Grand Marshal who had faced down fleets without flinching, took an involuntary step back, her hand flying to her sidearm. "Cousin," Vakira's voice boomed, amplified by the room's acoustics. "You seem to have misplaced something of mine." Seraph stared, her face a mask of utter disbelief and primal horror. You're dead!" "A vicious rumor," Vakira said, taking another step. Clank. Hiss. "One you started." Tevrin drew her pulse pistol, her hand shaking slightly. "It's a trick! An android! Kill it!" Vakira's movements were not graceful. They were not swift. They were unstoppable. She moved with the relentless momentum of a siege engine. Tevrin fired. The plasma bolt sizzled, scoring a black mark on the thick steel of Vakira's left leg brace. She didn't even slow down. She closed the distance to the dais. The Citadel Guard, their communications in chaos, their commanders scattered, hesitated. They looked from the ghost in the machine to the usurper on the throne, and their nerve broke. At that moment, the side doors to the throne room were thrown open. Elian stood there, flanked by a dozen of the hunters, their ceremonial armor now functional, their weapons leveled. The rebellion had moved from the streets into the heart of power. Vakira ascended the steps to the throne, each step a thunderous declaration. She stood before her cousin, towering over her. Seraph scrambled back, tripping on her own robes, falling against the throne itself. "The crown, Seraph," Vakira said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. Trembling, Seraph reached up and removed the circlet of power. She held it out. Vakira took it. She didn't put it on. She held it in her hand, her gaze sweeping over the terrified council of matrons, over the defeated Tevrin, and finally to Elian. He gave her a single, sharp nod. The Queen was dead. Long live the Queen. Hours later, the fighting had subsided. The Citadel was secure. The leaders of the rebellion and the surviving nobles were assembled in the throne room, a tense, volatile mix of hope and terror. Vakira stood before the throne, but she did not sit upon it. Elian was at her side, his hand resting on the small of her back, a quiet, steadying presence. The heavy exoskeleton was powered down, its silence as profound as its earlier noise. She looked out at the sea of faces, the scaled, the furred, the smooth-skinned, the conquerors and the conquered, the masters and the slaves. She saw the foundation of her empire, a thing built on pain and subjugation, an empire she had championed, an empire that had betrayed her, an empire that Elian, with his quiet decency, had shown her was rotten to its core. She met his eyes. He gave a slight, affirming nod, a confirmation to the pact they had made in the dark. "Today, a new dominion is born," she declared, her voice ringing with an authority that had nothing to do with crowns or titles. "The new dominion I envision will not be built on the backs of the enslaved, nor fueled by the suffering of the conquered." She raised her free hand, the one not holding Elian's. "My first decree as queen is my last as a conqueror," Vakira announced, her voice resonating with the force of historical change. "From this moment forward, the practice of slavery within the Thalmassian dominion is abolished. All sentient beings are free. All debts of servitude are nullified. All chains are broken." A stunned, absolute silence fell over the throne room. For the nobles, it was the sound of their world ending. For the rebels, it was a silence of disbelief, the intake of breath before a new reality could be comprehended. Then, a single Skarn let out a guttural roar of triumph, and the room erupted. The war for the city was won. The war for the Dominion's soul had just begun. Hours later, as the first light of dawn painted the bruised sky in shades of orange and rose, Vakira and Elian stood on a highway balcony overlooking the capital. Pockets of fire still burned across the sprawling cityscape, monuments to the price of their victory. She was exhausted. The immense physical and emotional toll of the day had settled deep into her bones. She leaned against him, letting his strength support her, the heavy, powered-down braces a dead weight on her legs. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close against his chest. The silence between them was comfortable, complete. She thought of the long, difficult road ahead, of shattered economies, of vengeful nobles, of a society that had to be rebuilt from its very foundations. It was a terrifying, monumental task, but for the first time, she did not feel alone in her power. "I built an empire with iron and fire," she said softly, her voice raspy. She rested her head against his shoulder. "You ruined it with soup and poetry." She felt, more than heard, his quiet chuckle. He pressed a kiss to her temple, just above the elegant curve of her horn. "You're welcome," he murmured. They stood together, watching the sun rise on the first day of their civil war. It would be bloody. It would be uncertain. But they were together. Queen and slave, general and officer. Those roles had fallen away. They were Akira, Elian, partners. And as they faced the dawn of the new world they had made, that was enough.